So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you all had a really great, productive day so far. I've heard this has been a wonderful conference. My name is Edline Jacquet, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy and Research at FPWA, which is the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. But I am longtime member of the network family, because for 5 years, I was the senior policy analyst here. So I'm so excited to be here and be back, especially for this particular workshop. I'm just thrilled that we have Marc Dones here to talk about the issue of addressing and finding solutions, right, to addressing the issue of institutional racism and homelessness, and really how the supportive housing industry and movement can address the issues of racial inclusion and equity in our work. So I'm just super excited to be here. Last year, I moderated a panel on promoting people of color in leadership in supportive housing. So we really feel happy to be able to build on the work and the network's kind of movement towards doing more racial equity work and inclusion in this industry. It's just so important. So we're so happy to have a really noted and respected national expert here to talk about this stuff, as well as, and I heard that the morning session was amazing. So I'm basically here to introduce Marc Dones, who's really a leader in the field of equity-based systems transformation, and he leads the equity work at Future Laboratories. He has the most amazing title. He's a civic imagineer and equity specialist at Future Laboratories, which I think is a great name, a great title. His work is really focused on transforming systems delivery to vulnerable populations, particularly homeless people. And it really is critical because he's done this work for several years. Previously, before they were at Future Laboratories, they served as the director of SPARC, which is supporting partnerships for anti-racist communities. And Marc has really helped to transform the national conversations around homelessness to include a racial equity lens. Prior to Marc's time at SPARC, they were at the office, the Massachusetts Executive Office of Health and Human Services, where Marc designed and implemented program and policy responses for youth violence, LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth who are experiencing homelessness, and as well as working on community health equity issues. So Marc really is an expert in this work, and I think it's amazing that we have such a full room to talk about how we can really both think through the challenges, but really also focus on how we can begin to transform these systems, right? Because they are systematic issues, as well as our own work within our own organizations. So I'm so excited, and please welcome Marc Dones.
Thanks. Hi again, everybody, or hi for the first time. Nope. Hi again, everybody, or hi for the first time. There we go. We're all awake. Okay, so my name is Marc. Again, that's my Twitter handle. If you want to learn about the lab, you can go to future.com, and really all you'll see is that we're hiring. Do consider it. I also, this is new. So someone came up to me during the in-between time and was like, "What do you tweet?" So, because I always say, don't follow me unless you want not serious Twitter, which people get confused about because they hear me talk and they're like, it'll be very serious. So I thought I would just real quick give some examples. Imagine being a seagull is pretty rad because it's basically just endless fries and permission to scream whenever you want. Starting my new job today, please join me in praying that I can make it till the end of the week before revealing my real personality to my new coworkers. And this I tweeted from the hotel restaurant, sitting in a hotel restaurant, and a man is complaining about having to help his wife with breastfeeding their new baby. Ma'am, we won't ever meet, but please know I'm wishing you all the best luck in finding an absolute shark of a divorce attorney. So those are my tweets. Again, do not follow me for more of what I'm talking about today. Follow me if you like that stuff. But I really want to disabuse you of the notion that you will experience serious things in my Twitter feed. Okay, so I'm going to start. So this morning I kind of like launched into a whole bunch of stuff, and I realized when I was thinking back on it that I was remiss because I had not situated you all to who the hell I am or why I get to talk on stages. So I thought that I would start by sort of giving you a little bit more of my background, more than is in the bio, which is, I don't know who that person is. They seem neat. But do you ever have that, like when you read like a thing that's written about you and you're like, I don't know who that is, because they probably pay their electric bill on time. And like, I don't. So, my name is Mark. I'm a psychiatric anthropologist by training. I graduated just down the street at NYU. And I've spent most of my life now working on figuring out how to close the gap between what we imagine and what we've got. Which is, I guess, how I wound up with the title like Civic Imagineer, which is just so silly. But I'm gonna make it something. Y'all see. So in that space, I've really been dedicated to thinking through like what would happen, like what would be different if fundamentally we realigned how our society functions, so that instead of saying like, oh, like, you know, it's operationalized for like, you know, 40% of us to do all right and everybody else to real struggle. If instead it was operationalized around the idea that showing up is commiserate with being worth something, is being valued, is being accounted for, and really moving us away from this mindset that producing things that are sort of a general good fit is good enough. One of the things I say a lot is, you know, in 1800 it may have been acceptable to say like, here is a burlap sack, it's the only burlap sack I know how to make, we can only make one size burlap sack at the burlap sack factory, so like, here you go, right? But it's 2018, and we can do way better than that. And we actually have a responsibility to do better than that. And it's my belief, right, that what we should be aiming for in our policy, in our programs, in our governance, is specificity, right? We should be able to meet people's needs specifically. I should be able to say that there was a program or a thing or whatever it is that anybody in this room needs out there available to them. And the fact that I can't in the most resource-rich nation in the world, in one of the most resource-rich cities in that nation, is a crime. So that's what I've been thinking about. In my previous incarnation, I used that thought to think through this lens of SPARK, which again is supporting partnerships for anti-racist communities and sits at the Center for Social Innovation. When we put together Spark, we were looking at the statistic, which I mentioned this morning, of just, you know, so if this is from 2013, but if 13% of the general population was black, then you looked at shelter population and said, okay, so that's 40%, right, is black. And when you started to aggregate in other folks of color, those numbers spiked to between 60 to 70%. And that statistic had been cited over and over and over again for at least 15 years by the time we got to 2013 and started saying, okay, so like maybe this is a thing we should focus on. What we did in order to think about that is partner with 8 communities. We collected 171 oral histories from folks of color experiencing homelessness, conducted 21 focus groups, and examined over 180,000 client records from HMIS. That was the work that had been done when I left the directorship. They may have done more by now. They're very busy. We had a great team. I want to sort of break down just briefly why this is important methodologically. I think oftentimes when we talk about research, we can sort of gloss over methods because methods are super boring if you're not a researcher. I see you nodding. But I wanna talk a little bit about the methods because I think they are different, and I think that it matters. One thing is that for all the things I'm going to talk about today, there are some of you who might say, like, oh, well, these things are true for white people too, or these things are true for, white dudes the same way that they're true for everybody else. That could be true. I don't care. Like, that's not what I came to do. I'm being quite frank, right? Like, I did not come to do research on the needs of white men because, to be quite frank, there are trillions of dollars that go into that research every day. I came to do something else. Methodologically, you will note that, like, all of the oral histories we collect are from people of color. We did not do a control group because that's not what we were trying to understand. And that's really, really critical because oftentimes in research, people of color, or broadly speaking, folks from historically marginalized communities, are treated as the afterthought, not the primary thrust of research. And so as a result, we don't know a whole hell of a lot about what folks from historically marginalized communities actually need. So there's a reason why we stand around all day in various conference rooms and boardrooms across the country and throw our hands up, and it's because we actually don't know what the hell we're doing. I hate to inform you. That is the result of a conscious and deliberate set of omissions from our research agenda for the past 50 years. So our team was looking at filling that gap, and so as a result, we focused only on folks of color. Another researcher should do the other work, right? I'm not saying that white folks might not have their own specific needs. I am saying that was not the thrust of this work. And in fact, moving into equity spaces, this is your first lesson on implementing equity. Moving into equity spaces is about specificity. That is the thing. And anytime you start trying to build general approaches, you are no longer doing equity-based work, you are doing something else. So if you are not able to say about your program, your policies, your whatever, right, that it meets the needs of this person specifically, then it's not an equity-based policy. And one of the easiest examples, I give this example quite frequently, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but one of the best examples I have of that, as a person who travels way too much, is when I was in my 20s, I was like, I want a job where I can travel. And then I got it, but I was no longer in my 20s. And so now I spend a lot of time being like, I would like a job where I would stay in one place for just a little bit, and maybe my bones wouldn't hurt. We're gonna get there. So travel all the time, and turns out there are not a lot of places that carry products for black people's hair in those TSA travel size containers. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So if you want some shit for my hair, you can buy it in a tub or an extra size tub, like a super sized tub. And before some very intelligent person in the back of the room says, yes, but you can get the travel-sized bottles and transfer, I would invite you to remember that if I used Garnier Fructis, I wouldn't need to do that. I could walk into any CVS in the land and load up on little bottles of Garnier and head to the airport. That's what equity is about, right? Because equity is actually about the specificity of meeting people's needs and the assumption writ large that I don't know, people of color ain't gonna need to be on enough planes. Or look at the reverse, and it was perhaps that no one in the meeting that finalized those TSA regulations was in fact a person of color. That's the other way that equity works, is you do not arrive at equitable solutions from inequitable tables. So if you walk into a meeting room and it's all dudes, I don't know what you gonna do for ladies. Probably nothing. I walked by a meeting the other day. I'm not kidding. I'm nosy. And so I stuck my head into somebody else's meeting because that is my business. And I literally watched 4 men tell a woman that gender equity wasn't a big deal? I'm not, like truly, like it's the kind, you can't write that. Like it was, I literally, like it was these four dudes and like one woman, and she's like, maybe the theme of the event is gender equity. And like one by one, they were like, oh, it doesn't seem big enough though. What? Half the population isn't big enough? That's kind of weird. So, you don't get to equitable solutions, right, unless you have rooms that are constructed with the folks that need to be there in order to arrive at those things. So truly, right, like if you walk into a room and you're like, hey, there are no folks of color in this room, hey, like there are no LGBTQ folks in this room, specifically on that T front, right, like if you don't have trans folks involved in like key decisions, especially around built spaces, around navigating with safety, like you will be forever trying to retcon your stuff to meet those needs when you could have just asked somebody to attend the meeting. Okay. Anything else? 21 focus groups. So those focus groups were with folks of color experiencing homelessness, thinking again about like how can we get people to share, maybe a group dynamic will be more comfortable for some folks. Also with stakeholders in communities, so asking questions about like has equity factored historically into how you thought about homelessness. And then the last group, which I think is particularly interesting, was with providers of color, right? So asking people who are responsible for delivering services or administering service systems who are also folks of color, like what do you feel is going on? And shockingly enough, there were a lot of suggestions. It's almost as if no one had ever asked. So like the thing is that like oftentimes, right, like folks of color are charged with implementing or, you know, being the frontline staff on all kinds of stuff that is essentially like it's for our communities. And like from day one, we'll be like, this is a bad idea. And like nobody asks. So like when we ask providers, right, like, hey, like what do you think? A lot of folks, I mean, like the specificity of people's like, it's this policy specifically, you'll find it on page 7, about halfway down. Like people had thought about this a lot. So this was not like, and the same can be said, frankly, of talking to folks with lived experience. Is like, these were like very actionable systems and policy level ideas. They were not like, oh, like I would like it if people were nice to me. And I think often there's a really, really, really deep-seated arrogance, frankly, in the way that we engage with folks with lived experience. That like there's this presumption that like if we ask folks a question, that like they won't be savvy enough to give the answer that we need, or you know, that they'll talk about experiences at like the micro level when we're trying to get to the macro level because we're managers and we're very important. And that's not true. Like people have absolutely the level of sophistication, the level of savvy to engage in these things if they're asked. So that's the background of the work. That's what I spent the last sort of 3-ish years of my life doing. There's a report, if you go to centerforsi.com/spark, that's where all that stuff lives. There's a report that we wrote on the phase 1 work that has recommendations. I'm gonna go through some of them today. But I just wanted to sort of situate you guys and like, sort of like, where do I come from? Like where do these recommendations and these things I'm about to talk about actually find their ground? Because what I think is really important is that, I said this before, but just to reiterate, is that I'm not saying things just because like I enjoy saying them. I'm saying them because these are like data-driven strategies. And you can do equity in a way that isn't saying like, you know, oh, we're waiting for justice to roll down from the mountaintop, right? It's actually an implementation plan. All right, so to define racial equity, which I think is always important because we all walk around with different ideas of what words mean, and I like to set a baseline. So racial equity is not just the absence of overt racial discrimination, it is also the presence of deliberate policy and practice that provide everyone with the support they need to improve the quality of their lives. So again, you'll see that specificity there, right, about like providing people with what they need to improve the quality of their lives. I also want to say that like if I were to sum this up, right, to like sort of like bring it out of its rarefied academic space, I would say that what this says to you is that it is not sufficient just to stop doing bad shit. You need to do good shit. Like, that's what that means, right? Like, it's not just the absence of discrimination, it is the presence of something else. And we've focused a lot in this country on, like, getting to that absence of. We have not so much focused on getting to the presence of. And what we have found, I would submit to you, is that when you just focus on getting to absence, all you do is bury the lead, right? Like, it's all still there, it's just silent and harder to navigate. So we really need to think about, like, what does affirmative policy look like? What does policy look like that says to people in this country, not just it's okay that you're here, but welcome, we're glad you're here. Those are different vibes. Oh, we came to church today. So equality is not equity. That's like another key takeaway, right? So again, it's this idea that, like, it is not just like, here's the same burlap sack for everyone. It is about the specificity. You may have seen various versions of this before. This is mine. Because I asked the graphic design shop at C4 to make me my own version, and the lead designer there was like, yes, you're a child. Let me make you something that fits how you operate. So if this is equality, right, this is equity, where we actually do deep investment in targeted ways to map onto what people need. What I think we often leave off of this, because I'm sure everybody's seen a version of this by now, but I think what we often leave off is that we are aiming for this place. This is where we want to get, where we have addressed the inequity, and so people are born into a world that is already ready for them. That's the goal. And so when we talk about equity investments, we are actually not talking about, like, endless pouring of money into things. We're talking about strategic, time-limited, but when I say time-limited, I don't mean a year. I don't mean a year and a half. This is probably a decade or two of work. But still time-limited investments in bringing communities up to where white folks, and particularly cis white heterosexual men, have been sitting for a minute. I'm trying to think, is there anything? Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to bring that back. So in this space, right, about thinking about, like, what does it mean to do this work with specificity, we have to ask ourselves, what is our obligation for dismantling racism and building those affirmative policies at each level, right? What do we need to do as individuals? What do we need to do inside of our agencies? And then what do we need to do in our communities, right? Like, those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves, and it's important that we operate at all three levels. It is not sufficient to operate at the agency or community level without doing your self-work. I will repeat that. It is not sufficient to operate at the community or agency level without doing your self-work. Because, like, what I will not have, just won't have it, is for a bunch of people to go out into the world and be like, I'm anti-racist now because I heard Marc Dones speak, and they're still a racist. Like, I'm not interested in that. That will not be my legacy. So, if you haven't done your self-work, do it. Find some books. Read Michelle Alexander. Get a good friend and ask them weird questions. But do that work. I cannot stress that enough. One of the things that, like, was revealed to us inside the last election cycle, which I'm very much looking forward to never discussing again in 2 more years, is that we suddenly found out that, like, America's social networks were monoracial. Meaning, right, that, like, while we have done a pretty decent job of integrating the workplace, right, like, everybody has to work with somebody who isn't quite like them, we didn't really say you had to live that way at home, and so people don't. In fact, right, like, what we found is that white folks leave work and talk mostly to white folks, if not exclusively to white folks, and folks of color do much the same. We gotta fix that. So, like, truly, when I say, like, find a friend and ask weird questions, find a friend and ask weird questions. Like, there is a real vulnerability that's necessary in order to do equity work right at the individual level, and like, we all have to be open to it. And we all have to be open to getting called on our shit. Not a day goes by where I don't like relitigate 16 interactions in my head and say like, oh, did I do an ism? And the answer is frequently yes. It's a real bummer, but it's like very true. And it's gonna stay true until I die. It's unfortunate, but like I've made peace with that. That kind of like rigorous practice and like figuring out like where are your touch points in your life where you can go to have whatever conversation you need to have. I remember I was talking to a friend of mine who's very much responsible for the fact that I'm capable of managing most social interactions. I'm extremely awkward. If you talk to me in the hallway, please know that like the entire time I'm like, oh, I hope I'm making the right face. So I have a friend, Christina, who's like been very helpful with helping me make the right face. And one time I remember we were at a party and we left and I was like, oh, like, you know, this person was talking to me and I think I just like hate her and like, I just don't think she's interesting and I just blah. And Christina looked at me and said, I hate to break it to you, but that's just misogyny because that person is maybe the smartest person in the room most times. And like you don't like her because her voice, like she's an uptalker. Like she ends her sentences in a way that like always goes up and has a slight vocal fry. And like culturally we've all been told that that's the way dumb people sound. Because, and then we like told ourselves that and then we like said to women, you should talk like this. It's very messed up. Like several parties later, we were in the same space again, and I was like, let me listen to what this woman is saying to me. Christina was right. I was being a misogynist. Like, she's way smarter than I'll ever be. Like, those are the kinds of things that you just gotta lean into, right? And you have to be willing to come to the conclusion that you really messed it up. So I cannot stress enough that you gotta do the individual work. All right. I want you to turn to your neighbor and for 2 seconds, have the conversation, well, 2 minutes. What would equity look like at each level? Like real high level. Don't get into like, and then we would implement these kinds of reparations policies and redistribute the wealth. Like, I would love those plans at a later date, high level. Ready? Go. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. If you can hear me, clap 4 times. Don't make me come back there. All right. I learned that from my mama. I want you to go back into that conversation, but now I want you to add this lens. How do those responsibilities differ between white folks and folks of color? Go. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. If you can hear me, clap 4 times. I can see you. Okay. So, I hope you all had very lovely, if brief, conversations that didn't have a ton of microaggressions in them. Let's just be honest. If they did, we can talk. But so what I am trying to push you towards experiencing is the migration from colorblindness to colorcognizance. These are frameworks. So colorblind is a framework that's been dominant since the 60s, emphasizes similarity, assimilation, and is, informed essentially by the idea that because we are all like bipedal mammals, that like there's enough that we share that like we can just immediately get down together. And like, nah. Colorcognizance, on the other hand, right, is culturally particularistic and acknowledges that like race, ethnicity, like culture, like socioeconomic status, all that stuff has a really big impact on who you are as a person. And so as a result, starts with a really different jumping off point, which is actually, I don't know you at all. But what I can do is ask you questions. It's a really different vibe when suddenly nothing is presumed. And like to be like just 100, like the power of presumption is how certain circuits of inequity reinforce themselves. And, so I talked this morning about how, like, soft skills are racist. They are. The reason that I said that this morning, I will get into this more a little bit later for folks who weren't here this morning, but the reason that I think that's so important, and the reason why I'm bringing it up now, is that, like, we presume that there is a common enough text for how people are educated and what is appropriate, that, like, there's just a way to be professional. And that's just not true. Moreover, right, it does not in any way, shape, or form acknowledge the fact that what we norm that idea of appropriateness around is white dudes. I was having a conversation in the break, and, like, one of the things that came up, someone was bringing it up to me and was talking about how, like, because, like, in soft skills, right, we talk about handshakes and eye contact and what clothes are appropriate. There is a reason why I give presentations the way that I do, why I dress the way that I do, regardless of context, and it's about modeling, right? Like, I am a queer Black person in America, and what I want to model is that I am good at my job, regardless of what I'm wearing. Like that's the tea. What's also important is that we consider the fact that, like, and this is what I was talking about over the break, is that, like, there actually is no, like, empirically driven way to, like, measure the right amount of eye contact to make. Like, that's not a thing. And, like, anyone who, like, is trying to tell you that it is, like, really far gone. Like, that's just not real. And in fact, right, like, and this is what the person was sharing with me at the break, right, like, is, like, especially in communities of Black communities in particular, if you make, like, weird eye contact with me for too long, I'ma think we're in a fight. Like, that's what's culturally appropriate for me. So, like, if you just, like, steady gazing, like, into my eye, like, I will literally go to another room and be like, what is wrong with Tony? Like, is there something I need to know? Also, right, like, the same can be said of handshakes. I cannot tell you the number of times I have gone to shake someone's hand and been like, what is this death grip? Like, what are we trying to prove? Like, sure, like, maybe don't, like, just present me with this hand, but, like, I don't know why we're fighting. Like, what is all of, like, I don't know why we're doing that. All of those things that are considered, like, super normal and regular to do, that's only normal and regular for some folks. Everybody else has long wondered what y'all are up to. So that's why we never did it. Didn't really get the purpose. Which brings me to white privilege. Did you think I wouldn't talk about it? No, I gotta talk about it. Oftentimes when we talk about white privilege, we do it the wrong way. And the way that we do it is we talk about things like, oh, like, white people make more money, white people do this, white people do that. Like, all that's true. Like, that data is all there, right? That's not necessarily what white privilege is, though, right? And I think oftentimes what white folks struggle with is, like, they do not experience, like, a magical bag of white money that shows up on their door every morning. And so, like, when you're like, white privilege is real, white people are like, well, I didn't get the memo. Or, like, the white money fairy must have missed my change of address. But that's not white privilege. White privilege goes back to what I was talking about before about the fact that I can't just walk into any CVS and find, like, travel-sized, like, Shea Moisture bottles. Although they are in some. I will say that. They are in, yep. When I first saw one, sorry, you're just giving me life. But when I first saw one, I thought, like, truly, I was like, well, I must be dead. Like, this is too good to be real. So, like, this is, like, I've just been shot, and, like, this is, like, my brain hallucinating. Like, what are the best things that could happen, like, on the way out? Because I did not think I, like, touched it, bought one. No, so to be clear, right, like, white privilege is about that the world is normed for your experience so that you show up not having to worry about being accounted for. That's what white privilege is. It's not about like all the other stuff. The other stuff is in fact the collateral benefit of that first thing. So when we talk about white privilege, what we need to be doing is examining what are the things, if you are a white person, what are the things that you never have to worry about, right? There's a scholar, Dr. McIntosh, who has something wonderful that you can all find online called Unpacking the Invisible Privilege Knapsack. She's a feminist scholar. She did something really incredible, which is listen to black women. Because a number of years ago, she was giving a talk. This is like back in the 70s, 80s? I don't know, time is fake. But so she was giving a talk, and afterwards, like some black women who were also feminist scholars, sat down with her and said, like, look, your work is wonderful. It does not account for my experience, right? Like, I am not accounted for in this work. And Dr. McIntosh did something really awesome, which again is listen to black women. So she went home, and rather than being like, none of this is true, I'm good, I vote the right way, she started thinking. And what she started writing, and this is what the invisible privilege knapsack is she just started listing places in the world where she was already accounted for, right? And so she was like, oh, I can travel without having to worry about getting my hair done on the fly, right? Like someone will always be able to do my hair. I can travel without having to worry about finding a makeup shade in my hue. I can always find pantyhose that are the right shade, on down the line, right? So she just kept listing things that were like, I never have to worry about this. I always know this is gonna be there. That's what privilege is. And you can run that same exercise on almost anything, right? Like, so you could ask that question about maleness, about cisgender, about, non-LGB identities broadly speaking, right? Like, these are ways to investigate privilege, is think about the ways in which the world is normed for you already, right? So like, as a non-binary queer person, like, the bathrooms today are just a nightmare for me. Like, that's a thing that other people are not worrying about today. Just to be real clear, right? So this is how we think about privilege if we're gonna do it in a way that I think actually yields something that's usable. And so when we talk about, so let me bring, I'm just gonna stay on hair care today. So again, thinking about like being able to find, what you need in any given context, if you walk into a drugstore, again, let's go with that model, right? You can always find like the Pantene and the Garnier, that kind of stuff. Folks of color, where is our stuff? In the back. Ethnic hair care. Behind the cashier, locked up. I do not hear a lie. The thing about being a person of color trying to find something to do your hair with is, where is it gonna be? You don't know. So truly, anytime I go into a grocery store or drugstore that I have not been before and I need something for my hair, it is a magical time of find the stuff. Because sometimes it's not even near the other hair stuff. It's like 3 aisles over for no reason near toys. And you're like, well, I'm unclear what this stock decision was for, but okay. Or it's behind the counter, right? So you wander the aisles for an hour and then go up to ask somebody and see it's right there. So that's a different shopping vibe, right? Than just being able to be like, that's the aisle that says conditioner, so I will find my conditioner there. So when we talk about like, what does it mean to have the world normed around you, it means that everybody else who doesn't have that experience wastes literal time trying to figure out how to make the world work for them. Like, imagine what I could get done in a week if I didn't spend at least 2 hours of it looking for hair shit. I could have all kinds of new thoughts. I could have solved so many things. If we aggregate that time across a year, 2 years, and then we add into it the time I spend being anxious about a bathroom, or the time that I spend worrying about how I'm presenting myself on stage talking to a room, or the time that I spend like relitigating an experience I had with, a white person who's 2 years my junior but somehow is in charge of a lot of things. These are questions. Okay? So if you are gonna do this work again, right? Like you have to do the individual work, which means thinking about like where are your privilege points, and we all have them. So I want us all to investigate like what are the things that like we don't worry about, and what would it mean to use those privileges to open pathways or open spaces or advocate on behalf of someone else. Because fundamentally, equity starts with a seat at the table. So when we're talking about how equity gets done, and I said, you can't do equitable solutions from inequitable tables, that means that truly equity starts with a seat at the table. And oftentimes that means that someone with more privilege, more power than those of us who would be at those tables needs to make that space. Being a good ally is not speaking for me, it is making sure that I am there to speak. In that space, thank you. In that space, what I would say is that oftentimes, right, like there are a lot of you who, again, will walk into rooms and be like, this room is all white. If you're having a meeting and the room is all white, I would suggest you have a different meeting. Why is this room all white? What are we doing wrong? What could we do better? These are questions. Same with if the room is all male, you get where I'm going with this. So the Spark team issued some recommendations. Here they are. I'm not going to go through all of these because I want to take a deep dive into a specific vein, but I would encourage you all to read the report, which again, centerforsi.com/spark, phase 1 study findings. We released those in March. I think it's good work, All right. But what I want to talk about is economic mobility. I talked a little bit about economic mobility this morning, and I just wanted to like keep the through line, right? So one of the things that we talked about this morning was just that like the reason this graphic is set up this way is because truly if you have a white sounding name, you will get more callbacks. 50% more than a black sounding name, in fact. I sent this to someone after the previous session, but so my name is Marc Edward Thomas Dones. It's a very good name. It has seen me into institutions that would not otherwise give me the time of day. I'm very sure. And the reason I'm sure is that I often have showed up for interviews and said like, I'm Mark, I have an interview, right? And had people say like, oh, I will be right back. Okay. So of those 171 folks, right, like what I want to highlight is that they were majority employed. This is also something that we don't talk about a lot, in part because we like this myth that folks experiencing homelessness are like experiencing deep poverty and don't know how to manage money and don't work right and da-da-da. It's a great myth. We have told it for a long time. It is a myth. It is a lie. It is weird. We have to let it go. Truly, like when I say the majority, I mean like upwards of 90% of the 171 respondents we had 1 to 2 jobs. It didn't matter though because neither of those jobs, if there were 2, could add up to a housing wage. And I want to delineate because I'm talking about a housing wage, not a living wage. A living wage presumes that maybe sometimes you would like to eat or enjoy a movie or be someplace other than in your home. That, it turns out, is so far away from what we're paying people that I've decided to roll it back and just talk about the housing component. Because we're not doing that right. So I don't know why we're like having these conversations about something way over here when like we have to set our sights on something that's a little bit closer to we would like people to be inside. Employment discrimination is a thing, it turns out. And earlier I played audio from some of our respondents. I'm going to do that again. Again, because I think it's just really, really important that we listen to people. and use their experiences to ground what we're doing. And if folks are not able to be physically present, there are ways to bring them into the space, just to be clear. I'm going to keep going. If a tech person comes, I'm going to go back to this. What you would have heard was folks talking about how race and ethnicity actively impacted their employment, right? Like how there's a respondent who talks about how people, after she's a server and after she served folks, they would go to her managers and say, like, we don't want that Puerto Rican waiting on us. Or another person who talked about how she has a college degree and shouldn't really ever have to worry about employment, right? But is consistently offered temporary spots instead of permanent employment, is consistently shunted into employment that doesn't offer benefits, that gives her no opportunity to save. Again, if someone shows up and some magic happens, I will play those. So I want to talk about what we can really do to change, right? So one thing that I want us to think about, so we talked about implementing, right? So one thing I want us to do is I want us to connect with our workforce investment boards. WIBs do a ton of work. They are frequently not working in our spaces because those connections aren't there. Okay, thank you. I want us to think about how we connect with employers, because it is not about like thinking about like what are the soft skills, right? Like there are hard skills that people need, and it is employers who can tell us what those are. Again, I said this morning, but I'll say it again for those of you who were not here. Google doesn't care about your soft skills. Google only cares whether or not you are a gifted engineer. In fact, most people who work at Google are kind of weird. So like, I just really want to stress that like, this is not a question of soft skill development. This is a question of hard skill development, and it's about connecting with employers. And it's about getting employers ready to work with the populations that we represent. And I think that like, when we talk about those conversations, I think we also need to be including that like, there's flexibility that's required when you're dealing with actively navigating trauma and moving out of homelessness. And so like, we don't want to send people to employers who cannot offer that flexibility. We just don't. And like saying that a job, any job is good enough is actively setting people up for failure. So like, truly, like, we need to find pipelines into employment situations that will work for the people we serve, not just that end in some kind of job. Summer job programs are really important. I used to fund a whole bunch of them when I worked for the state of Massachusetts, and turns out all those young people who we were funding because they were at risk of violence were also experiencing a lot of instability in their lives. Some of it was housing related. So like, we should think much more dynamically about what it means to connect with those kinds of programs. We should also acknowledge that those programs are still kind of whack. Because like, if I need money, I don't just need it for the summer. I probably need it all the time because of how capitalism works. So like, I don't want to be up here saying like, summer job programs are a panacea. Like, they are a tool and we should use them, but we should use them with the awareness that they are not amazing. And in fact, all of this, I would say, like, what we really need, like, honesty is such a, it's you being honest. I made a decision like 15 years ago to be honest all the time, and like, it has been so freeing. I just say shit, and later on people are like, did you mean to say that? I'm like, yes, because it came out of my mouth. One of the things that we can do when we're connecting people with things that are kind of whack is tell them that they're kind of whack. Because it's a real, like, it's a stressor to walk around the world. It's called minority stress. To walk around the world thinking that something is off while everybody tells you that it's actually A-okay. So if we have to use bad tools, what I would encourage us to do is tell people, I sure am sorry, but this is what we have. We are working on doing better. But know that your experience of this, if it is messed up, That's not on you. We can think about 21st century Vogue tech. So the Department of Labor, a very curious institution, does all kinds of curious things. One of those things is forecast what jobs are going to come online. They do that actually with like really surprising and scary accuracy. And what we could do is use that data. Because they don't just do it in terms of like big forecasting, like which sectors will emerge. They just straight up do that seasonally. Like what jobs are going to be hot jobs this summer for like the Cape in Massachusetts is a thing I can look up. And what we could do is use that data and align people with the skills they would need to step into those roles, as we know that folks are gonna need to hire into those positions. And if the best we're able to do is seasonal employment, what we can do is strategize with people ahead of time about being able to make sure they are employed for all 4 seasons. Which leads me to predictive and hotspot training, which leads me to investing in your own workforce. So like if you run a program, if you are management at a program, if you have access to someone who is management at a program, I said it this morning, I'll say it again, like we should not run a field that is supposed to be responding to a homelessness crisis that predominantly affects black and brown folks, employ predominantly black and brown folks as our frontline staff, and pay them so little that they are on the edge of experiencing homelessness. That shit is criminal. So let's not do it. If we find that we are like saying like, oh, you know, I need to have this many staff because like it's really important because like we get to touch so many lives, yada, 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 I would invite you to remember that people you employ have lives that you are touching as well. And so you should probably not contribute to the problem. And if that means you need to do less, do less. And if that means that you have to tell your funders, I will no longer participate in this kind of exploitation, because that's what it is, do that. Like funders, like speaking as a previous funder, right? Like there's all kinds of stuff I didn't know. Like, and in fact, right, like the feedback loops between funders and grantees really could use some work. But that starts with management, senior management at agencies saying like, we need to sit down and have a conversation because like this isn't gonna work long term, and so we need to figure out like what is the solution here. I'm very solutions oriented, you know? I also want us to think about working at systems, right? So the definition of a system, because we talk about systems a lot, but again, we don't define things that we talk about a lot. A system is a set of elements or parts that is coherently organized and interconnected in a pattern or structure that produces a set of behaviors often classified as its function or purpose. Systems. This means 2 things, right? One is that when we do systems thinking, we think about interactions that produce behavior. So we don't actually look at the constituent parts, we look at how things touch. This also means, right, that if we're thinking about expanding to take into account larger and larger sets of interactions, eventually we will hit spaces that are necessarily outside of our purview. What that means is that we need to invite people to the table so that we can have those conversations. Like, we gotta partner, and we have to aggressively partner, and we have to put staff in place who can do those partnerships. And not development partnerships, partnership. Why use systems thinking? It allows us to focus on outcomes, privileges outcomes over stated goals, allows us to look at the sum and the parts, views the structure as the source of behavior. I could talk a long time about this, but I just want you to have like a preliminary primer on systems thinking, because I realized that like increasingly I'm seeing systems thinking talks like floating through this space, but like no one actually talks about what that means, and I was just concerned. So this is a quote that I really like around why using systems thinking, right? So even when solutions work, you need to solve a whole set of systems problems to implement them at scale, and a bad system always trumps a good program. So like, we will never program our way out of homelessness. because the underlying drivers are systemic. One of them is systemic racism. So until we start addressing those root causes, we are only band-aiding a problem. It also allows us to think about not doing small pilot programs and confronting issues at scale from the start. So like when you go home and you're like, oh, I heard this great talk on structural racism by this person, they were so smart and very good looking, and I can't wait to do some of the things they were talking about, I would encourage you to think about not doing small pilots, but again, reaching out to other people and thinking about how you could build something that tackled whatever issue you were looking at in your community at scale from the beginning. Because what we have learned is that scale is not a separate question, it's what it means to solve the problem. Okay. The void. Now, all of this, the reason why I wanted to talk about systems is because we have to switch systems. We need to switch from a charity system. We've been in a charity system for about 60-ish years. Charity systems, right, started with this idea of like food pantries. So it was like people need food. Let's like put that in a place where they can access it, right? Food pantries grew into like adding clothing, right? So it was like, oh, like people also need like some socks. And then like those things kind of organized, became like, let's do a soup kitchen, right? Then that turned into shelter. All of this stuff was about like giving people things to meet immediate needs, needs that I would call important, but not the actual need, right? Because what was the actual need? Housing. It's like a weird, and like food is great. I love eating. The times in my life when I have had like food insecurity in my life have some of the worst times. But like, that's not the underlying root cause here. The root cause is housing. So what I want us to do is switch from a charity model to an equity model. Came in with a flair. This is my ugliest slide and I love it. Which means that we start with the idea that society is predatory. Like, let's just start there. We don't live in a society that wants us all to succeed. If we think about that, then we understand that like what we're actually dealing with is an iceberg, and so homelessness becomes the tip of that iceberg, and inequity becomes the thing that's driving it. So if we think about how do we address inequities, right? That's why housing first is a thing. Because there's no such thing as housing ready. That's the party line. But it's true, right? That's not a real thing. And you just got to put people inside if they want to be inside. But it also means that we can reimagine the function of wealth. Like, what do we do with money and why? Why is our relationship to it so mired in the idea that if I've got some, it's just mine and you can't have none? And like maybe we could do truth and reconciliation because of the slavery and the genocide. We could like acknowledge those things that were done. Building an equity model, right? Building an equity model for society, for a field, for anything is a massive system shift, which is why I wanted to define systems. Because it's not just about what an individual program can do, it is about what programs do together, about how the interactions between different sectors create the world we live in, and about how individuals add up to agencies, add up to a community. She had a theme. And so we just gotta burn all that down. Just like really burn it down. It's not good, and we gotta stop doing it. So I wanna talk a little bit about like what the future could be, because I work at Future Laboratories. So some of you may be familiar with this. It's the Way Home America Community Dashboard. I helped design a couple measures on this dashboard, and I want to highlight those because they are the equity measures. So Way Home America, for those who don't know, is an initiative focused on ending youth homelessness in America. On the dashboard, you will see that there are equity measures that look at the number of youth of color on by name lists, and then it also looks at how folks are moving and into what destinations. So this is a really, can everyone still hear me if I'm over here without the mic? Yeah. Great. So this is a really simple measure that I would encourage us all to use. It's just how into housing. It's very simple to do that. All you have to do is disaggregate the data you're already collecting by race and ethnicity, and then look at what outcomes are what. What I would encourage you to look for is parity, so that what you want, right, is flow through that looks the same. So if 71% of youth on the by name list are youth of color, then you want 71% housed. 69% is pretty good. What we should also move towards looking at, though, is return rates, because there's a lot of data that suggests that folks of color and LGBTQ folks are coming back into the system at higher rates than other folks, right? So this flow through looks good in some of these communities that have been working on it, but the return rates may not look as great. Okay. The other thing I want us to think about is, like, what are the real underlying drivers that are keeping people inside homelessness, right? And how could using equity address those things? So you've got economic insecurity, poverty traps, lack of peace of mind, and socioeconomic costs. This is a flowchart. It's really great. I want to look at this one instead. So if we think about operating in this space, right, and saying, like, okay, so there's mental bandwidth and time, limited access to resources, high and volatile cost of living, low and volatile income, flawed program incentives, and all of this sits in this, like, sea of systemic bias, right? It's like this raft floating on, like, a dark and quiet ocean. I'm trying to give you a little bit of what Jacquet gave you this morning. What this means is that we need to think about how can we break these cycles? Like, where is the pressure point that we could apply direct relief to that would get somewhere? Any guesses on what I'm going to say? Any ideas? No? Okay, I'm going to tell you. You ready? We could give people money. What a weird idea. I saw some of you clapping. You can clap. It's a good idea to just give people money. Because if I go back, actually, I'm going to go back. If I go back to this, what you'll see, right, is that there's this limited access to resources which feeds into mental bandwidth and time and low and volatile income, right? So, like, that one node is tethered to several other core drivers of people's experience of homelessness. And when I talk about mental bandwidth and time, by the way, just to explain what that means, what I'm talking about there is the fact that, as James Baldwin said, anyone who's ever been poor knows how expensive that is. It costs you a lot to be poor. In money, in time, in emotional energy. It turns out people make terrible decisions when they're stressed. It's a thing called cognitive load. And humans are remarkably, like, we think we are so damn smart because we got these opposable thumbs. No. You, like, all of you who say that you're really good multitaskers, you're not. You lie. Humans can't work, like, really work on more than one thing at a time. As soon as you start to split off your attention, your performance drops by orders of magnitude. Like, not like, oh, like, it's 10% worse. Like, it's cut in half. You are bad at two things instead of being reasonable at one. So, when we ask folks who are experiencing homelessness to think about 70,000 other things, it's not possible. Physiologically. It's not just because, like, they're lazy and they don't try hard and I work real hard. No. It's because you're not as worried. And not being as worried has freed up a lot of your brain to do other stuff. So that means that if you just gave people money, they might be less worried. It's not like the science behind this is so rock solid, it's bananas. It's drawn from like 5 different fields, all of whom are like converging at the same point. Related to that, we might buy people's debt. So many of the folks that we spoke to when I was working with C4 talked about their experience of homelessness beginning with like a sudden $200 expense. right? They blew a tire, they had a spiked utility bill, things that like truly like just like there was no extra money to keep up with. Or, right, they had like $1,500 in credit card debt or $1,500 in, you know, again, utility arrearage. It's so little money. We spend so much money on like deep end services that I'm not actually convinced everybody needs. And in fact, right, like because we wait until people can qualify for those deep end services before we offer really any help at all, that goes on that previous slide as flawed incentives for programs. So like, you know, I just, for funders in the room, I would encourage you to think really hard about like, are you funding enough diversion? Because like diversion is the key to this. I mean, long term the key is like rewriting America, but the intermediary key is diversion. Because a lot of folks don't need a case manager, a social worker, and 16 like teenage volunteers to manage their lives. All they need is $200. And all that other stuff is way more expensive than just giving them the $200. Just a thought. And we can also think about direct relief. And when I talk about direct relief, what I mean is like, so if, you know, someone needs to move in, like this is a real case, actually. I once was party to a conversation, I will not tell you where there was a person who couldn't move into an apartment because the apartment didn't have a refrigerator, and what they were trying to get their kids back, and CPS wouldn't sign off on the living situation as stable without a refrigerator. It wasn't considered viable, right? Refrigerators are expensive, and it turns out this person didn't have refrigerator money lying around. So like maybe the refrigerator was purchased somewhere out of some funds from something. Maybe. I don't know, I wasn't there. I signed off on it. But like those are the kinds of things, right? Where it's just like, just buy the refrigerator. Like, oh my God. Like, are we gonna spend 3 months being like, where are we gonna get this refrigerator from? Who will donate a refrigerator? Like, can we partner with like Siemens or Philips or say like, we gotta get buy it. It's like tremendously easy. Like we have massive multi-million-dollar program budgets and we like sit on them like weird dragons being like, if only someone would help. I just don't know. And for those of you who are out there saying like, but there's policy. There is policy. We wrote it. And in fact, oftentimes, it's just policy. It's not regulation and it's not law. It's just policy. And for those of you who need a quick update on civics, law, you shouldn't break. Regulation takes a whole hell of a lot of work to change. Policy, you just wrote down one day and decided to do. It's actually very changeable. Like, at any given time, when I worked for the state, we could retract 16 policies and put out 17 more. We didn't even have to do public comment. We just would be like, shit's different today. Sorry about it. So like, it's not like this idea that it's so phenomenally complicated to get the thing done is very often not true. And so like, if you are feeling a barrier, I would very much encourage you to figure out if that barrier is just in your own policies. And then just change them. It doesn't have to be that deep. The last thing I'll say is I talked earlier about how America is just like one big dumb hallucination, right? Like we are all caught up in like a weird hallucination that about 25, 23-year-olds had like 250 years ago. that wild? Like, we talk about the founding fathers like they are so wise. They were 25. Like, truly, right? In 2018, when someone talks to me, they're like, I'm 25, I'm like, girl, wait. Things are gonna get weird, and then they're gonna get better, I promise. Your 30s are incredible, they're exquisite, you're so grounded, you're so centered. But like, we really are hung up on the idea that like some 25-year-olds from 300 years ago like knew better than everybody who could ever come to be. And like, probably not. Separate issue. But because it's all imaginary, that means that at any point in time, we can just like make up new stuff, right? That's all policy is it's just like stuff we made up and we're like, well, now we gotta do the stuff because we wrote it down, right? In fact, like writing things down and thumbs are like basically the only inventions that govern human existence. Everything else is like 100% deeply imaginary all the time. And there's another Baldwin quote. I'm just Baldwin today. There's another Baldwin quote I like, which is, he said, the future is like heaven. Everyone exalts it, but no one wants to go there now. And I would submit to you on this day that it's probably time for us to go to the future. Because it's like 2018 and we all watch the Jetsons and we don't have flying cars, but I'm willing to bet we can house everybody outside. I'm done. Thank you. So we have time for question and answer. I'm going to put my contact information up there while that happens because I don't have business cards. New job, y'all. So my email is marc.dones@future.com. Again, that's my Twitter handle. If you're curious about getting engaged with the Spark work at the Center for Social Innovation, you should email them because I don't work there anymore. So that's spark@centerforsi.com. And I love them all very much. They're incredible people who do incredible work. So encourage you all to get involved with it if it spoke to you in any way. Please. If you are worried about your projection capacity, there is a microphone right there. Sorry.
Can you try and run that slide?
Sure. I was gonna, yes. Let's see what happens. So do you feel like racism or discrimination has affected your experience of being homeless at all?
I think it has.
Can you tell me about how?
Because, okay, when I first became homeless, I was working. I worked at Subway inside a children's hospital.
Uh-huh.
And my manager was white. And her thing, I told her, I said, look, because she had cut my hours. And even though we were staying with my kids' aunt, my name was still on the lease. And it was half my job to pay half the bills and everything. And I told her, and she went and cut my hours, and I was like, why'd you cut my hours?
Mm-hmm.
And she wouldn't say nothing. I mean, I went from working 50 hours a week down to 9 hours a week.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm like, how can I afford to take care of my kids? And she's like, well, I don't like the way you talked to me this morning. I'm like, okay, what's that mean? And then the man that is her assistant, he came up to me. He said, she doesn't like you because you're black.
Well, I used to work for Denny's for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a lot of people just turn away from me. We want somebody else, we don't want her. They would say it just like that too. But and these people will come in for at least like 2 weeks and at the end, apologize to me. Because I actually had to go up to them. They said, we don't want her. I waited on them one time and they said, we don't want her ever again. Is she Puerto Rican? We can't have her waiting on us.
Because my name, like if you see it on paper, this guy actually told me this, not the employer, but a guy actually told me this, because I had him look at my resume and stuff. He was like, I portray on paper that I'm white Caucasian. He said, by my name and my background experience in the workforce. And he was like, but when I look at you, this is not what I see. He was like, so they was told that the employer was really a biased person.
Do you feel racism and discrimination have affected your experience, either becoming homeless or
I
how it's
do.
been?
Economics, that's what affects us. We don't get the same shots at employment. This is my experience. We don't get the same opportunities for employment as white people. Like, I have a college degree. I should never even have to worry about employment. Never got the good job with the benefits. Always something temporary through a temporary agency. And that's going to lead to homelessness. No economic. If you don't have an economic basis, well, you know, you're going to fall right on into homelessness. That's the way I see it. I did work when I could, and I'm just saying the jobs weren't enough, weren't making enough. I never got the benefits of it. I'm 60 years old. I shouldn't be out here struggling. I should have a job. I should have something, be in the retirement program. It was always temporary this and temporary that. I took them. I ain't had no choice. But I'm saying, you can't never, once that money gone, that's it. And it ain't that much.
Yep. Yep. Yes.
Hi, I have a question. So while I can acknowledge that housing first is really important, do you have any suggestions as to how we can continue the goal of equity after these folks are already housed? Supportive housing to me has the opportunity or has the space to become a system that continues to oppress people of color. So do you have any suggestions to how we can continue to strive for equity even after they are placed in residences, places that are supposed to assist them?
Sure. So one thing that's really important is that every system, as currently engineered, has the capacity to oppress folks from historically marginalized communities writ large, right? Like, you can't, it's almost impossible to engineer something that's like truly equitable inside our current world. And so like you gotta stay vigilant. Yeah. The thing that I would say there is, I think that there's, I think that, like, truly, right, like what Housing First opens up as an opportunity is something that we talk a lot about but don't really do, which is, like, people should get to make their own choices. And so what I would say is the opportunity here is to rigorously and routinely present people with their menus of options and not be bound up or caught up in making those decisions for them. So to the extent that people say, like, oh, these are the kinds of supports that would be helpful, these are the kinds of things that would not be helpful, et cetera, that to me is the future here. Because, like, I just think it's really important that we recognize that, like, folks experiencing homelessness are not, like, dumb. Nobody is incapable of making the right choice for themselves. And the narratives we tell ourselves about, like, what's possible for people who are living with mental health conditions or living with substance use disorders are also myths, right? So, like, again, full disclosure, I've written about this a lot, so it's, like, very much out there if you Google me, but, like, I'm standing here today as a sexual assault survivor with, like, very active PTSD, and, like, I have all kinds of things that are, like, very hard for me to do, and I have access to the supports that make sense for me, because I have the class privilege to be able to engage and support selectively in a way that makes sense for me. That's what equity, I think, looks like inside the supportive housing context, of, like, really, really, really acknowledging that, like, folks are smart enough to govern their own lives when given access to the right resources. And the last thing that I would say is that like it's really important that we plug into ways to make all of our services and supports anti-racist. Not just not racist, but anti-racist. So what does it mean to actively challenge racist constructions, misogynist constructions, transphobic constructions, et cetera? How do we do that work? And that again involves like doing that sort of rigorous work around like what it means to bring equity to whatever your specific program context is. I'd be happy to talk people through specifics for different program contexts if you reach out to me via email, et cetera. That's the thing that I do all the time. Yes, I think that's my answer. You're welcome. Yes.
Thank you. How do you, or I should say, how do we negotiate some of the points that you brought up regarding dismantling traditional notions of charity versus some of the equity systems that you recommended with regards to debt relief and cash?
Because charity is about pre-selection. Charity is a mode that says, I will select for you what you need. Equity is about offering you the power to make those choices on your own. In our current economic structure, that capacity for selection is tethered to cash, right? Like if you have money, you get to make choices. Everything else, right? Like so, for example, like the ongoing battle around most of welfare is like, but what will they spend it on, right? Any charity model has at its core, I will make this choice for you in some way, even if it's just limiting the field on which you can choose, because I don't trust you to make good choices, whatever that might be. Which, by the by, a thing that I hear quite frequently, which like drives me just like to despair, maybe, is like when people are like, oh, well, I didn't want to give them $10 because maybe they'd spend it on drugs. Okay, you could spend that $10 on drugs, but somebody gave it to you. Moreover, quite frankly, like if you are living on the streets of New York City and you're like, I would like to be high today, like my response is like, girl, same. Like that shit looks rough as hell. Like I would not begrudge you any kind of relief, right? So like, and finally, right, like, what would you rather they spent it on? An apartment? What am I do with $10 looking for an apartment? Like, that's not available anywhere, right? For those of you this morning, right, who heard me say this already, someone recently told me that to move into an apartment, I would need to give them $10,000. So truly, like this micro-policing of like what folks experiencing homelessness, poverty, whatever, are gonna do with $10, ooh, sorry. Just makes me tired. Yes?
How do you think government should do racial equity work in terms of their role of like, obviously, they're the system, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you think they should go about, because so many of our, like, so many supportive housing providers get government funding. And then some of this mandate, right? The policies that you talked about come from government. So I'm really curious as to what you think the systematic approach for government is.
First and foremost, governments and government funders need to audit their policies and declutter them. Like, right? So that's what I was saying in terms of like, just like, there are so many things that are not law, are not regulation. We just like wrote them down one day and now we think that that's how the world runs. And there's nothing to stop us from like thinking about them differently. So just like a clean audit of like, what is stuff that is set as policy versus what is stuff that's set in another way. And to look for specifically, right, like, so once that's done, to then look for like, where are there policies that are likely to touch historically marginalized communities, and how can we make those policies, again, affirmative rather than neutral or silent? So what would it mean to move into a policy space that is affirmative of historically marginalized communities instead of just silent on their existence? And there are a lot of tools, also, to look at like what organizations you're funding. Are they situated in the communities they're attempting to help? Are they led by people with either lived experience or led by people who are, again, like sort of that community? If they're, oftentimes the argument for that is like, oh, well, love to fund this agency, but they're just not ready for an investment of this size. They don't have the fiscal protocols, et cetera, et cetera. All the agencies that are like typically white-led, are very large multi-service agencies, a lot of them received capacity building dollars from funders back when that was more of a thing. So rather than saying like, oh, we can't give to this agency, they're not ready, we should be building them up the same way we built up these other large organizations that are already in existence. And then also there are really great tools like the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, GARE, has great checklists for like how to do a racial equity driven procurement. So like there are 100% tools out there that are like very simple checklists that you can go through as you navigate these kinds of things. And again, if you reach out to me, I'm also happy to assist. No problem.
Hi.
Hi.
I am a frontline staff, I guess, and I work directly with people within a home first, housing first model. So my question is, what would you suggest a conversation should be with me and another person who is in the program who kind of has the mentality of, well, like a enabling personality, like this is it for me, so you're just gonna pay and pay and pay until,
Yeah.
and they have no desire per se to plan for if the funding disappears.
Yeah.
So those are conversations that I have often with my team, and it's kind of hard to, because you don't want to say, well, you're not entitled to this or that, because, everybody should be entitled to live in a house. I mean, but at the same time, you want to build equity.
Yep.
So they know that after this is over, I can do this by myself. I know where to go. I know where my supports are.
Yep.
But how do you tap into those individuals that are like, this is it for me. So if it's gone, it's gone. I'm back in the street.
Yep.
I'm going to repeat this cycle.
That's a good question. So three things. The first is to say that I think that, to go back to what I was saying about like the importance of honesty, I think it's really important to say to people, right, like generally speaking, like what I'm about to tell you is fucked. So like, I'm sorry in advance, but like I'm about to tell you that like this money is absolutely gonna go away. And like, I wish I could tell you something else, but I can't. So like, that's thing one. The second thing that I think is really important is to say that, so we talk a lot about like learned hopelessness, learned helplessness, right? And like, if you get the shit kicked out of you every day for 40 years, at a certain point you're just like, well, I'm real tired. And I think that's valid. Like, I think it's okay to be tired. And what I would want is a world that says, look, we did this. It is, in fact, our responsibility to care for folks who've been this beat down, right? Because it wasn't that, like, nobody wakes up at 5 years old and is like, I don't have any dreams and I never will again. Like, that's not a thing. And so I think it's just really important that we honor that, like, wherever people are right now, they got there on a path, and that path may have been real messed up. And so, which brings me to my last thing, which is to say that I really, really think that in absence of resources, like in absence of the capacity to say, like, look, we can't actually take care of you forever, like, and we're very sorry. I think that the best thing that we can do is work as a community to wrap around people, right? So that's why some of the innovations that like Community Solutions and some of the other folks are driving around, like by name lists, so like really knowing everybody by name in your community who's experiencing homelessness. Because if money is gonna run out and I'm not gonna be able to provide supports for you anymore, and I, can't even necessarily, like let's say it's the worst of all possible situations, I can't provide support and I don't know how to connect you with somebody else who could take over, right? Because it's just like, we're at the end of the rope. At the very least, like weekly case conferencing in a multi-agency way can begin to look at things like, who here this week has talked to Brian? How's he doing? What's he need? And if that's the best we can do right now, that's the best we can do. But I really try to take definitive turns away from saying like, oh, well, you got to harp on that person until they're, like bootstraps mentality. Like that's garbage based on the idea that we didn't beat someone down for 40 years before they got to a place of saying like, I don't really have any hope. Sorry if that's less optimistic. Also tell your funders to keep funding things, like talk to philanthropists, I don't know. Anything else? I also am not wearing my glasses, so I don't know if anyone. All right. Bye, everybody.